Thank you, David, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the best gold market of your lifetime. My main credential for speaking to you, in my opinion, is that I'm old enough to remember living under the gold standard when people still talked about monetary order and even thought about the theory of money. That time seems to have long passed. At Seabridge, we have stated our thesis on gold on our Twitter site in 280 characters as follows. No V-shaped recovery, no return to normal, Fed actions can't halt defaults and job losses. Effective Treasury-Fed merger puts Trump in charge of both. Inflation unexpectedly runs as money supply booms, the Fed monetizes huge deficits, and confidence dies, and gold soars. That, in a nutshell, is our thesis. And, in our view, the key to this is that we have entered a brave new world of modern monetary theory, and so nothing will be quite the same again. This isn't Kansas anymore. We have crossed the monetary Rubicon, and there's no going back. Now, what does this new world look like? Well, it's one dominated by central banks and the market's response to them. The Fed balance sheet has gone from $4.5 trillion to $6.6 trillion in just a month, an absolutely staggering increase. Guggenheim, for one, and they've been pretty good so far in their predictions, thinks that we're headed to $9 trillion. Jeffrey Gundlach has predicted 10 trillion in Fed balance sheet. It's not just the amount, although the amounts are obviously important, but also the immense speed of these injections, which are entirely unprecedented. We're looking at a Fed deficit this year of $3.7 trillion, about 15% of GDP. Again, unprecedented, except for a period during the Second World War. So we're looking at year-end a deficit, a total Fed or federal debt of about $27 trillion. And, the size of a trillion no longer seems to mean anything. We've gone from M's for millions to B for billions to T for trillions. But just to put it into context, if I were to pay you $1 trillion, I could give you $1 every second, and it would take 32,000 years for you to get your $1 trillion. So this is an order of magnitude of money that really defeats ordinary logical thinking. And this is different from the response to the Great Recession and the QE that followed that episode. It's more, it's faster, as I've said, but it's also mainlining the money into the real economy. There are payments to individuals and businesses. The newly created cash is not squeezing into the financial markets the way it did in 2009, 2010, 2011. This is going into the purchase of goods and services, which is inherently inflationary when there is no production on the other side of it. We are supporting consumption. We are not creating savings and investment. So this is, in fact, Ben Bernanke's helicopter money that he famously spoke about in 2002 when he went to Japan to lecture them on how they should proceed. The Treasury market cannot run a 15% of GDP deficit without the Fed as an active partner. And in fact, if you follow the CUSIP numbers on the bonds that the Treasury issues, within a day or two, they end up over at the Fed. So we are creating dollars out of thin air to pay for government spending. That used to be the very definition of how you create inflation. And this response is different in another sense. The Fed has probably, you could say, shredded the last of its credibility and certainly the last of its independence. Its credibility went over the last 18 months when we had such abrupt shifts in Fed policy that are really laughable now to read historically, look back in time and see the things that Governor Powell said. It's quite mind-boggling how much of a transition he was forced into without his head up, without any apparent knowledge of what was coming at him. And in terms of its independence, I think we have to say now that the Fed has been taken over by Treasury, this new set of SPVs, special purpose vehicles that have been established with down payment money of say 10 billion from the Treasury and the rest up to $1 trillion financed by the Fed. You know, this is really making the Fed a subsidiary of the Treasury, and it's turning the Fed into a commercial bank. So the last pretense at running this thing the way it was originally intended has, I think, been sacrificed. So what we have now is a president, President Trump, with his finger on the money button. And it's never been that clear before. Now, will this matter? And if so, when and where? And I think that the Achilles heel here is really the foreign investor, the foreign owner of US securities and cash, which in fact totals $25 trillion. So lots of it out there. Historically, when you see inflation take off, and that is a prediction, you see a loss of confidence first among foreign owners of the currency, and then the more domestic holders of the dollar or whatever currency is involved then begin to question their positions. And I think this is where the dollar is in fact most vulnerable in the next little while, is that foreign owners of the dollar lose confidence in the stewardship of the dollar, as they did back in the 1960s. For any of you who remember the London gold pool, that was set up to provide France, Germany, and other countries the opportunity to turn in their excess dollars for gold. And in fact, that's what they did, plane load after plane load. The total reserve of gold held by the United States went from 22,000 tons to 8,800 tons during that period, when in fact there was a strong preference by foreigners to own gold rather than the dollar. We think that kind of flight from the dollar is once again likely in the months ahead. And let's not fool ourselves. A weaker dollar is precisely what the Fed wants. The Fed wants inflation. It's made it very clear that it wants inflation. It regards deflation as taking unnecessary risks with people's jobs, creating more defaults, and so on. And that's probably true. But the inflationary route that they seem interested in pursuing is not a walk in the park either. Now, you look at someone like Scott Minerd, who's a favorite in terms of commenting on money and the credit markets. He's made it very clear in his perception that if the Fed wants inflation, it's just a matter of commitment. They can get the job done. And if you look at the numbers, they're headed in that direction quite successfully. If you look at MZM, the tightest definition of money that is immediately available for expenditure, it's now growing at an unprecedented rate of 20.3% year over year, and the rate of increase is rising every month. So this is a very interesting narrative to watch. I now look at that number every week as the new data comes out. So if you look out there, the common narrative is that inflation is dead. Actually, you know, in our view, it's been sleeping under a blanket of government-created deceptive accounting. In fact, it's been eating away at people through education and health costs and others very clearly, but nonetheless, the perception is that inflation is dead. And it's important to understand how inflation occurs. You know, if you read the classic economic texts, they'll tell you to look out for cost push inflation, where the driver of inflation is the wage levels pushed by organized labor, or you could get the other side of it, demand pull, where there's an excess of cash pursuing fewer goods. But in fact, serious inflation comes about in purely psychological terms, when people, ordinary people, lose confidence in the dollar or whatever currency is being discussed. And we're now doing all the things that are necessary historically to cause a psychological collapse in the currency. Free money to millions, bailouts of the unworthy, and deficits for consumption purposes, not investment. In fact, modern monetary theory in action. The alternative, obviously, is gold. And that is where, you know, we think safety lies for the ordinary investor and large institutions as well. We're vulnerable to a collapse in the currency over the next several years, and this is the way you protect yourself. That is why, in our view, gold is going to soar over the months ahead. Thank you.